Thank you very much. Appreciate your help. Hello all, and welcome to our panel. We are going to talk today about, everybody say hi. We're going to talk today, and it worked. Usually synchronicity does not work over Zoom. We are going to talk about world building, about leaderships, innovation in leaderships, in genre. It's going to be awesome. I would like to start by introducing our lovely panelists, experts truly in their field. And I would like to start with Malka Older. She is a 2015 Senior Fellow, Technology and Risk in Carnegie Council International Affairs. She is the winner of the Prometheus Award in 2018 for State Tectonics. She's Malta alma mater at Harvard, Johns Hopkins, every university she went to. Every time I speak with Malka, I feel seriously overwhelmed. She's the author of Infomocracy and of Serial Box, which I must admit I haven't heard of before today, and I'm ashamed of that.
How could you not have heard of that? I'm supposed to make fun of him.
Somebody told me. Yes. Well, fair enough. I should have known about that.
Well, since you've never heard of it, I'll give you a pass, but I'm an author at Serial Box. There are a lot of authors who write for them, and it's mostly collaborative work. And I think you'd really enjoy it, Gadi.
Thank you. That is really cool. See, we're already starting to have fun and enjoy ourselves.
Yes.
Next, I would like to introduce... Fun. You are having fun. Awesome. It is pretty late for you. I would like to introduce Ada Palmer. She is an American historian and writer. She's an expert on the Renaissance and a musician on top of that. What's with all the success here on the panel today? Overwhelmed. She is the winner in the 2017 of what is now called the Astounding Award for Best New Writer. She is a finalist for the Hugo Award for Best Novel in 2017 for her To Like the Lightning. She is researching the history of ideas. How cool is that? I mean, I'm sweating over joy. I wish this panel was about ideas. And also,
it is.
The fourth and the last novel in her Terra Ignota series is coming out in the summer of 2021. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Awesome.
A year from now.
A year from today, maybe even.
And she's early June, but yeah.
And you're also currently writing a nonfiction book on the history of censorship, which brings us again to governance and the reason for this panel. And lastly, and importantly, of course, we have Andrea Hairston. She's the author of Will Do Magic for Small Change, and name for a book which I love. She was a New York Times editor's pick author. She's the finalist and won endless awards, such as the award now known as the Otherwise Award. She's a professor of theater and Africana studies, director of Chrysalis Theater, and she's also announcing that The Master of Poisons, her book, will come out on September 8, 2020, coming up really soon from Tor.com. So with that, I would just like to get us started and stare at you as I try to figure out who would like to come in first.
What was
Going
the question?
Once? I have no question. There was absolutely no question here. I'm doing my job as a moderator by acknowledging you guys are better than me. And I just said, guys, I apologize for that.
I had threatened to begin the panel by saying, I think that world building and both doing world building and reading about things that have world building is good for you intellectually in the political sense, because it galvanizes you to think about how the world works and other ways the world work, and therefore to think critically about your world and the fact that people make choices about how to make it, and you can make choices about how to make it. So I'd like to start with that statement, and I know that Malka and Andrea can have fun things to add to it.
Right. So the fact that, you have to build a world implies that the world doesn't come the way it is. It's, there are all of these invisible things around you that structure how you think, how you feel, what you value, and you took them for granted. So when you start to build a world, you have to come to know yourself in a way that is critical, because before you just took it for granted. And now you have to go, do I value this myself, or did I just inherit it or soak it up or find it and accept it? And once you start asking those questions, you don't go back, right? So once you start world building, you keep world building your own world, the one that you live in, as well as the ones that you read. You go, well, did it have to be that way? So you ask the magic if. What if it weren't that way? And then asking that leads to other thoughts.
Yes, I agree so much with both of these, and they're so important. And that's why I think of it as like a speculative resistance, because the whole exercise is getting you to say what if about your own world. But I often, what I connect world building to often as the analogy is moving to another country that you don't know that much about and don't speak the language. And because that for me is what turned on a lot of those lights of, oh, it doesn't have to be this way because here it's totally different. And for me, the experience of learning things through that sort of observation and making connections was so powerful. It's so powerful every time I do it. That when I'm building a world, I try to have the reader have that experience, and I want them to have that sort of engagement of, oh, I have to pay attention, and I have to figure out what's different here from what I'm used to by seeing how people act.
Yeah. And it's also similar to, as a historian, reading a historical text, and you're coming to this to try to figure out how people felt about women in this period. But the letter is about, whether they should have a Baptist preacher or a different, preacher. They're not trying to explain the thing you want to know. You have to figure out the thing you want to know from what they've given you. And so similarly in world building, often the characters are having a conversation about somebody's arranged marriage. And from it, you're learning, oh, there are 3 different species and these 2 can crossbreed, but this one can't. And you're sort of deducing it from it, but they aren't explaining it to you. They're talking about something else and you're figuring it out. It's just like reading historical text, as well as being like moving to another country.
I would like actually at this stage to move to Andrea, because I believe you've done a lot of work around gaming in your mind around the John Rawls thing. Can you talk about that maybe?
Right. Well, there's a wonderful thought experiment by James Rawls, who said that, let's say you're on a spaceship and you wake up and you can't remember who you are. You don't know whether you're brilliant, or you don't know whether you're like good at something. You don't know whether you're bad at things. You have no idea. So where would you like to live? And you get options like, okay, so you could live in a society that is very unequal. And, all of it is, quote, a meritocracy. We'll just put that in quotes. There's like slavery. There's a small elite that is in control. Or you could live in an egalitarian society where there's some differences in terms of resources, but it's not huge. Or you could live in one where there's some of that and some of the other thing, right? So you get the choice. And when they do this experiment, this thought experiment with people of all ages, of different like political parties, of different genders, 90-some% of the people want to live in the egalitarian society. So one of the experiments that one of the social psychologists that I know did was take Sweden and the United States and present them, and 95% of us wanted to live in Sweden, right? Given the inequality that is in the United States. And also we underestimate the inequality in our own societies often. So in the United States, the inequality is enormous between the richest and the poorest. But most people underestimate how steep the climb is. And so we actually even put ourselves in that experiment and think we're in that egalitarian society that we would choose almost if we were on that spaceship. And so for me, part of the world building issue is to recognize what your society actually looks like, right? Because we actually don't know what it looks like. We think it's this other thing. And that, most of us really think we should be in an egalitarian society, but we're not acting on it. Why? Why don't we act on this? Why don't we change? Why don't we do what we actually would do if we were on that spaceship? So to me, that's a question that I want to ask of myself and of all my characters.
And it's related to the thing where when you poll Americans, 80% of Americans say they're middle class.
Yeah.
And what is this vast imagined middle class that almost everyone identifies in, and yet the differences between the top and bottom of the people who identify within that group is also vast.
Yeah. Right.
This a bit connects, in my mind at least. I mean, we started with Malka, who talked about such an experiment. Andrea has actually done it. Ada has just made it clear for us, and I, in my brain, currently go to Malka. Because, and don't look at me that way, Malka. It's because you actually wrote about information, how we process information, how information affects us. So maybe this question should go to you. Why don't we change? What stops us?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I call my book Infomocracy because it is ruled by information, because we are ruled by whoever has control of the information that we get. And there is, and right now we all get different information, which is partly by choice, and a lot of it is not entirely choice. A lot of it is what you grow up with and what is comforting, what sounds right, what is at your reading level or video level or connects with you linguistically or in a ton of other ways. But yeah, I mean, if you don't know that there's an alternative, and we see this I mean, it's the inequality in the US. It's also like the healthcare debate. I mean, it's everything, right? It's this constant in the US too. It's like this constant, this is the greatest country in the world. This is the greatest country in the world. No matter which political side they're on, they will say that. As opposed to, and other countries do this too, of course, but I think it's particularly explicit in the United States.
Well, there's a thing in the U.S. where it's sort of a person is disqualified as being a viable politician if they ever say any other country is better at anything than the U.S. is at.
We are exceptional. We are always exceptional.
And it's
Michelle Obama said, "Oh, I can feel proud of our country now," and she got crap because she admitted that there was a long history of not being proud of her country.
Yeah, I remember that. That was so if this is, for me, part of our job as writers at all, but especially as speculative writers, is to demonstrate to people that things can be different, because that is the first step in making them different.
And I think another end of it, and this gets, or Andrea, did you want to say something?
No. I was just agreeing with Malcolm.
And I think this gets into my bailiwick as a historian as well. Another one of the things that makes change hard is when there are systemic structures, which means that the people who have the power to make the change are people who lose out if the change happens. And it can be very difficult to wrap your head around how exactly that works. And one of the things that I work on a lot when I teach history, and where being a historian is really great for understanding world building, is a lot of the time when we teach history and we read history, and if you go back to high school and you remember learning about stuff for the first time, and you'll read about some terrible period and you'll be like, why didn't they just not have the French Wars of Religion? They were stupid. It was obvious who was going to win. Now, right? What is wrong with 17th century France that they had this very unreasonable war? Couldn't they see that they should just not? Why didn't the church stop being corrupt before the Reformation happened? Obviously something was going to go badly, and why didn't they just X? Is a very common attitude that the distanced and affectedly neutral voice of textbooks invites. It invites judgment. It invites this sort of clinical detachment. And so, in one of my classes, the one that students always say that they find most powerful, we do a simulation of the papal election of 1492. And each of the students is a different character involved in this. And some of them are cardinals who are vying to be pope, and some of them are kings who are manipulating the election, and some of them are the people who work at the Vatican. And the real challenge is, can they elect a virtuous person who's a good pope, who will do the reforms necessary to get the church to stop being super corrupt? Because 1492 is the max of how corrupt the church got in this period. And can they prevent a war? There are various things that are leaning toward war. Can they stop a war? And they all, abstractly would like there to not be a war, except for a couple characters who just directly benefit. But the reality of 1492 is that everybody who had the power to manipulate this loses out if they go with the peace faction. And that's just the realities of who's allied with who, and who has the power to give who what, and who murdered whose grandfather 2 generations ago and therefore wants to take revenge. They were just all this perfect storm of locked into everybody who has the power to vote for the peace candidate. As a result, their family will die. Europe will be better off, right? But their family will lose the family fortune, lose power in their city, lose this, lose that. They personally suffer if they choose the thing that is better for everybody. And it's vaguely a prisoner's dilemma situation, but it's, as the students find in these classes, very difficult to vote for your family to all be executed. Even when you know that it means Europe will be better off for the next 50 years. And getting students to zoom into that is incredibly powerful. And I'll end this with this particular micro anecdote about why this is useful, and one of the ways in which exploring other worlds, whether it's imagined other worlds, future worlds, or past worlds. One iteration of this election, we elected a terrible pope and had a terrible war on Tuesday and Thursday of one week. Trump was elected over the weekend. And the students came in the next week. And I had a morning class, which was my other class, and had the experience that most teachers did on the first class after the election, which was that all the students were sullen and blame slingy and bitter, and doesn't this prove the pointlessness of everything? Except the students in that class. The students in that class were, I understand it's the systemic relationships within the system. I want to now study and understand which politicians benefited from which things in order to result in the election of somebody that nobody actually thought would be a good president, just as nobody actually thought that the pope they had elected would be a good pope. But he was the pope that benefited all the people who had the power to pick who was pope. And they were full of energy and enthusiasm and the willingness to act. The morning class was full of depression, giving up, cynicism, there's nothing we can do. The class that had been enmeshed in a different world was the class that was ready to try to do better in this one.
Yeah, so for me, theater always works because that sounds like theater to me. So, James Baldwin said, no man is a villain to himself, right? So you as the actor have to get into the values and the system and the consequences. Like, if I do this, what will happen to me? So what is my particular conflict, right? And so once you do that, it's, the understanding that comes is like body understanding. It's not just like, oh, that's a cool idea, but that, the more you try to feel the people, and by feel, because we don't view emotions often as significant, but but we really need to understand what is their emotional reality as they make this choice, not their abstract logical reality, but their emotional reality. So that I did a class where I had people, they had to, I would never be in a minstrel show, or I would never be in a Wild West show, right? And I said, okay, you're an actor. These are the only jobs you can get. And they were all theater students. They went, oh, okay, yeah, sure. But they hadn't even themselves thought of that, right? That these are the only roles you can play. And you can play those roles or nothing. And the other jobs are really terrible and you hate them anyhow. And it took 2 seconds. They went, oh, right, yeah, no. And that's why people play those roles. So I think one of the things that helps people is to put themselves in the position of the people they would like to judge, and to see what, literally to get their emotional body into their emotional body, and to see what they can learn. And then how would you approach it?
The subjectivity of it.
Yes, the subjectivity of it, right.
So at this stage, I would like to go to our audience. We started talking a little bit about people and how people work. And we actually have a question. I'm not sure I understand the question. I hope you will. You're the experts. So Matt asks, message fiction has a reputation for building a world in which every person living in that future thinks politically the same as the author. Disagreement is magically gone. When designing innovations in governance and leadership, personally, I've never seen innovations in governance and leadership. How best can we incorporate how varied and uncooperative human beings are?
Ooh.
Well, yeah, go ahead, Andrew, if you want.
No. I message fiction. I'm not sure. So the fiction that I read, is complex. So it seemed like you were talking about simplistic message fiction, but complex fiction deals with that. And I happen to have Charlie Jane Anders' book right under my mouse, The City in the Middle of the Night. So this happens to be a book about, governance, about all these differences, about choices, about politics, about everything. And it's really messy, and it's an encounter with an alien as well that has a completely different world view and a different body.
No spoilers. No spoilers.
No, I know. I'm just saying, read the book. Read the book, because definitely not simplistic. So, I think the elegance of a fiction writer is to make a complex system available to us, which is not the same thing as being simplistic and having a melodrama where you have, okay, these are all the bad guys and they think this way, and these are all the good guys, and I'm using guys and I mean it. So I think we have to work on being as complex as our world, as writers, and doing that with elegance, so.
Yeah, I agree. First of all, to say message fiction just means that they were really bad at writing their fiction, because all fiction has messages of some kind.
Yeah.
And it's just, if it hits you over the head with it, then you have a problem. But I do feel that, I don't know, like when I wrote my book, I felt very strongly that the world I was building was not meant as a utopia or a dystopia. So it wasn't meant to be like 100% target, this is where we go for, and it's also not meant to be 100% warning, this is what we should run away from. It's meant to be, a kind of twisted view of our world so that we can see our world differently.
Yeah.
But what that meant was, I had this scenario that I put together, and I was really using the book and the trilogy to explore it and to kind of play out that thought experiment, which meant I needed different characters to have different views on it to represent my conflicting views on that world. And, there are some characters who are just bad, and those aren't particularly my views. They're just mercenary, or, they have other motivations that are not the motivations that I identify with or was trying to work through in my head. But the main characters who often disagree and come into conflict are really me being like, well, this thing is awesome, but also it has this other problem. And I think if you're building a complex world, I don't believe in perfect systems. I don't believe in perfect worlds. And I think if they do exist, they make really boring fiction. So if you're, when you're building a world, I think you want to build something that you have some nuanced feelings about, to make sure that, and then make sure that those translate into the different characters.
And I think another, related to that, the vital thing is to depict multiple people who have ideologies that are noble and worthy of respect, that are different and incompatible with each other, that therefore come into conflict about it. But both of them are a good, worthy of respect thing, and conducted in a way worthy of respect. Because one thing that you can often do is, here are two viable ideologies, but the people who advance ideology B also murder babies and dress like Nazis, and therefore we can disagree with ideology B, even though in the abstract it's worthy of respect because the people go about it in an evil manner. No, just have multiple people who have different ideologies, and you can't have both things. You could, or you have to work toward a compromise between the two things. But they're both reasonable things, and they're both being advanced by people who are worthy of respect, and who really disagree.
And you can also have people who don't have particular ideologies, but have understandable motivations, even if they haven't thought through, like, this is what I want to happen in the world, but they have, this is my life, and this is the thing that I want to do. And it's not against my principles, but, this is the thing that's most immediate to me that seems like the right way to go. And that's, that also gives it kind of because I think, we're also used to interacting with people who don't necessarily pay a lot of attention to politics or have elaborated theories of what should happen in the world, but still have, some basic ethics and principles, and are trying to find their way through that.
And I think one of the ways that can be most potent is when you take values that both of them, we respect those values right now, and then you point out a way in which those values can conflict with each other. Right. So let's imagine that we're looking at a medium near future where we're really good at growing vat-grown meat. And we're going to have a conflict between the group that wants to ban eating real animals and the group that wants to carry on traditional cultural practices of, having a Thanksgiving turkey, which you can't do with that grown turkey meat quite the same way, and people consider it significant, or even more importantly, if it were a religious ceremony that involves, a tradition in which there has to be an animal. We want to value both of those things. We want to value the rights of animals, but we also want to value the rights of people to carry on traditions. that's a interesting conflict, one where both sides are reasonable and no side is automatically evil, and demonic, you can therefore get into the nitty-gritty of how those two things can be in tension with each other.
I believe that it was a panel Malka actually moderated, where someone said, and I can't remember who right now, maybe David Weber, that we need to learn again how to be just wrong or to disagree with each other without being evil. But this actually brings me
amazing, to just briefly, another, if you want to try to be able to envision this, I want to get a hold of them and work with somebody on publishing them, but it's not my period, so I'm the wrong person. But at Harvard University in the archives, they have the papers of the Radcliffe College Women's Suffrage Club. These are the undergraduate women at Radcliffe in the 1900s and 19-teens who were promoting women's suffrage, and of the Radcliffe College Anti-Women's Suffrage Club, which was the young women at Radcliffe who thought women shouldn't have the vote. And they had a policy where you could be a member of one club and an associate member of the other club, which meant you paid half dues in order to support the cookie fund, and you attended the other club's meetings in order to debate with each other. And we have their notes and papers and the arguments that the girls who thought that if women got the vote, they would no longer be politically neutral and be no longer able to act as peacemakers and moderators in what would become a more, therefore, militarized and conflict-centered world. It's really fascinating material, but most fascinating is looking at those two clubs collaborating with each other so closely about the debate. It's just a neat glimpse. And so, looking at something like that and saying, okay, can you imagine your characters resolving their difficulty that way with this kind of mutual collaboration discussion instead of with blowing each other up?
It seems to me like we are constantly, in every panel I've been on, and this panel has really helped me frame that, we talk about not just one politics. We talk about politics in the books. We talk about politics outside with the readers in fandom, and also our own politics, what happens in our daily lives, especially now. And fiction is political, science fiction is political. And it seems to me like we're dancing around that topic. Maybe we can talk about that a little bit in world building and how much that comes into play. Maybe we can start with Andrea?
Malka said earlier, everything, all fiction is political. Every storyteller, has, something that they're, even if they don't know it, something that they value. I mean, art confers significance, right? So if I tell this story about these people, I have, there's an infinity of stories that I could tell, but I'm telling this story and I'm telling it about these characters and I'm focusing on this moment, right? And so all of those choices have to do with the power dynamics of my world, of myself, and how I confer significance, right? Because once I tell the story, the Hopi say the one who tells the story rules the world, right? Once I tell the story and people watch the story, that's different than the stories that have not been told, right? It has a place in our world and it impacts us. So for me, I talk about griots, which are West African historians, storytellers, chroniclers, shit talkers. I mean, there's a whole range of things that they do. They are often, they're all across West Africa, the ones that I have studied. And they knew endless tales that could bring all the people in the country together, because I know your family, that family, this family, and how we're all interrelated. So I make the community as a storyteller. They knew all the history of every other ruler, so I can tell you all the mistakes they made. They knew all the stuff about the plants and the animals, so I can tell you how to plant and how water works and how everything. So the storytellers were central to keeping the community in line and together. And so for me, they are incredible political figures. And so in my novel, A Master of Poisons, I have a young woman who's training to be a storyteller. And how do you train someone to do that? In the griots, you could spend your whole life becoming a griot. I mean, you had to learn all this body of literature orally, but you also had to recognize that you were a conduit of power, and that when you made a choice, you defined your universe. So how do you teach that? And so I have a character who is a griot who is teaching that other character. And that is, part of, and there's an empire and there's all kinds of other stuff going on. but the central position of, the sacred and non-sacred duties of the storyteller, because you create a cosmology, you hold your community together, is a political act. So that's why I started off writing a novella and it turned into a novel, because I realized that this is actually really hard. And you were going to do that in what, 30,000 words? Are you kidding? Yeah.
Andrea, I actually would like to stay with you in a second, maybe put you on the spot.
Okay.
We've talked before about truly wonderful works that you have been involved with, and even music. I specifically want to ask you, speaking on you, because I know that this is something you do publicly. I think one of the most political things right now, which we'll, I think, generally avoid to stay with world building, is the whole Black Lives Matter aspect. And Afrofuturism has been an immense and amazing outlet for political thought and how to handle your own feelings within the current world and in writing. And as you're so involved in that, I feel it will be a loss if we don't go to you and ask you about that.
Well, just what I was talking about was Afrofuturism, right? The griot.
I understand. I'm trying to ask you to
So
do more, and I'm being too long-winded about it.
Platform, right? So the idea that something I think I may have said on another panel with you, Gadi. It's the idea that we can really, we don't have to toss the wisdom of like large groups of people because they don't work in the empire the way we want them to work, right? So the empire is about monoculture. And the Afrofuturists are saying, no, we have wisdom that we can bring right up to tomorrow, not just that was back in the village or back in the day, but will influence tomorrow, right? So anything I do, I'm always thinking about how the wisdom of the ancestors, so the griots, the people who were making those communities and, understanding the world affects me today and will affect us tomorrow. And that to me is a particular political act because it says Black Lives Matter, right? It's not just the Greeks that matter, right? It's Sunjata that matters. And if you don't know Sunjata, go look him up. There's a wonderful oral poem of the kings of Mali, and Sunjata is one of them. There are many of them. I could pick more, but that one came to mind. And in those chronicles of Sunjata or other the Orisha of the Yoruba, the Ifa, the traditional amazing poetry that is, calling to the ancestors, calling to the spirits, is the wisdom of a people, right? So if you read that, you will be changed and you will make a different future. So that for me, the task I have is to maintain that wisdom and to add to it and to get it to the future. And that's what I've been doing. And because Black Lives Matter. So Sunjata matters. It's really critical that we know Tessan Weme, who is a current Igbo playwright who writes science fictional plays, right? So that's some of the stuff I teach. And she wrote a play about African women, the Reign of Wazobia, it's called. And in it, women are the rulers for a season. And then they decide, we're not going to leave, right? We're going to stay ruling. And so it's a very interesting play because the men are like, whoa, we have to depose this woman queen or king because she dresses up like a king. And she doesn't. So the reign of Wazobia continues because she's a wise ruler. And it's not about the past, it's about the future. This is a future Africa, but she uses traditional women's societies in Igbo land as the basis for the political structure that the queen represents. Afrofuturism.
Yes, to all of that.
Yeah.
I mean, all I can say is that we need all the futures we can get.
Yes.
I will say that one of the things sorry, go ahead.
Well, just, as you were discussing that, my brain jumping sort of in a zoomed out direction to the questions about science fiction being political. And, I've been on panels before about the question, is all fiction political or is all science fiction political? And it's interesting, those often become unproductive conversations.
Yeah.
But a way to think about it that what you were saying just brought my mind to just a little odd, but bear with me. So there's a sequence in Plato's Republic where he's discussing justice. And what is justice? And is justice the sentence of the judge being carried out? And an argument that's made there is, if the effect of the judicial system is to increase injustice, right? If the sentence the judge has passed down increases injustice and results in harming the good and advancing the wicked, you can't call that thing just. That something that increases injustice and decreases justice isn't justice, isn't just. And similarly, when you talk about the fiction that believes it's apolitical, there's plenty of fiction where the author didn't actively think about politics, and people say, how can you call it political when the author didn't have political intent? But it has the effect of increasing a political thing, just as that unjust sentence has the effect of increasing injustice, even if the judge sincerely thought it was just. And so if you, for example, are writing an action story and all of the people that you depict who have dark skin or hair and or who have some physical imperfection are bad guys, and you do this unthinkingly because you're just repeating things you've seen Hollywood do, you didn't have a political aim, but it increased this political thing in the mind of the people who are reading it and seeing that get reinforced. And so in the same way that the sentence of the judge, generates a certain amount of justice or injustice, that book, even though the author didn't have a conscious political intent, generates a political consequence, which I think is a good way of framing how, even if there was no political intent, let's imagine there was no political intent consciously in the mind of the author, even so the book is in a world where it increases the total mass of a certain kind of political force, in this case.
The storyteller underlines or repeats, like truth is often repetition. And by truth, I don't mean absolute truth, but the stories you hear over and over and over again are the stories that go without saying. So they actually move to the back of your mind so that you take for granted the truth that's in that story that you pointed out, and so much so that the writer took it for granted and then the audience took it for granted. And none of them necessarily have political intent as they do this.
Malka, did you want to expand?
I think that's such an important note. And I think the only thing, what I take from this and what I think about this when I'm doing it is kind of very similar to what I think also about academic writing, is that it's really important not to present neutrality, because neutrality doesn't exist. What is important is to, as far as you're able to, be transparent about where you are coming from and know what you are representing. And then, go from there, that allows people to work from that same position. Of having some understanding, some transparency of where you are coming from.
Yeah, you're reminding me of, I recently had a student whose senior thesis advisor ended up docking them points because they had used some 19th century secondary sources. And I went to the person who had done the grading. It was a grad student doing the grading. I was like, no, 19th century sources are great because sometimes A, they're the most recent published thing in English on the topic, but B, when they're biased, they're so biased. They're so transparent and visibly biased. You can really, really tell. It's a lot harder to be deceived by the biases in a 19th century history than in an earlier or mid 20th century history, which will feign objectivity and be much more likely to deceive an undergrad into going along with the subtle Cold War or whatever currents that are in the mind of the author. If you're reading a 19th century history and it's saying the reason that this war happened was that the king was born out of wedlock, and because they had adultery and loose divorce laws in this country, that's why there was a war. You're like, oh, I think this historian is probably biased. That's very valuable. The transparency and honesty of presenting where POV is coming from is valuable and also authentic to human experience. My students sometimes email me about how I have a whole folder of students of mine who have visited Italy after my class, and they'll take selfies next to their tomb of the character that they were and stuff. And they'll sometimes write to me and say, every time I see the coat of arms of one of my enemies on a building, I get really angry And at first I was thinking about how this was making me biased, but then I realized, no, nobody in the period didn't feel like that about some set of the coat of arms. In some ways, the incorrect and artificial way to approach this material is to be detached and have no opinion. Nobody felt like that when this was made. Everybody felt either, yes, this is my friend, or no, this man murdered my father. Nobody felt, boy, that's a bird on a shield.
It's interesting to me looking at the Hugo Awards this year, how the nominees can, you know how often people speak about a couple of writers talking to each other or being in conversation?
Yeah, being in.
I felt, sorry, not an expert, thank you. I don't know if that has a name. I kind of felt like throughout many of the categories, everybody was talking to each other. And it was all about colonialism and empire and personal experience of those topics. How and I wonder if you have seen something similar to that, and how leadership, specifically going back to the topic of the panel, leadership has shown itself, whether it's in fiction or in real life, to be.
I think it was about empire before. It was just about empire in an uncritical way where empire was good. And now it's about empire in a complicated way where empire has many points of view, and you can be excited about colonizing Mars, but also worried about what it means to be continuing the tradition of colonialism on Mars. So that, when you look at Golden Age SF, it's very about the dream of empire being expanded into space.
And right now in the chat, somebody actually wrote, let me quote exactly, there are conscious isms and unconscious isms. And I believe that in the discussion before, as we were prepping for the chat, one of the topics that was raised is, I think by Andrea, is visible is what often is invisible.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you can pick that up.
Making the invisible visible is one of the powers of fiction.
Yes.
Yeah. I'll pick it up. Well, I think it's sort of what Ada was talking about, like the 19th century visibility, transparency that gets covered over by the sort of, we're now going to be rational and objective. We're going to be logical positivists. We're going to, we can have a God's eye view somehow. We can sit somewhere and have no relative relation to things. And so that shift, that the 20th century is filled with that. And now we're, no, we can't do that. I mean, I believe Ada's writing a book about ideas. So like the ideas around that go, no, there's no God's eye view. There's only a position. You have your position in relation to others. And so I think that the stories that we have told are about the heroes, the great ones, the colonizers. And now we're saying, well, we're just going to tell other stories, but we're still dealing with the same stuff. It's just not from that particular positionality, right? Like, why is I remember thinking when I was in high school, like, wow, why is Caesar a hero, right? I mean, I took Latin, right? So we had to learn Veni Vidi Vici, and we read his stuff, and I'm like, gosh, wow, this doesn't move me in the way that I think I'm supposed to be moved, like a real powerful figure. And it just struck me as like, people have done that to my people, and all these other people, like, why are we excited about this? But that idea, I barely spoken, and my girl threw a chair at me. My teacher, who loved Latin, was like, he's a great Latin stylist. That was the response. It was a very interesting response. And I told my mother, and she just said, do your conjugations and get through Latin, but hold on to your ideas. And I think now the response is like, let's look at Caesar and say, what does that character mean in our world and our relationships to him? Not that he's, super evil. One could argue both ways, but what does it mean that there are people who have done that do that, and how do we relate to that? But we're now going to focus on the people, not on Caesar.
One of the chat things in
I'm answering it in text.
Fair enough. I'm not sure we want to pick it up, but there is a discussion going on right now.
I was trying to not
then how about
on it by answering it in.
Let's just address it. Please go ahead if you want.
I'm done. I've hit enter. The text has been.
Then fine. Let's go. And anybody who's interested, go back to the Discord channel. So Malka, you have been quiet for a while and listening and absorbing, and I wonder what thoughts are hanging in your head right now.
Well, I was just looking at the text, but I see that Ada's got that. Yeah, no, I agree with this. I want to pick up a little bit on what you had mentioned about the books being in conversation with each other, because I think that there's something else about that, which is that there are certain issues that we're reacting to in the real world that are triggering a lot of books about certain topics. And yeah, I mean, colonialism, I think there's an important recognition there that colonialism is not over, that post-colonialism continues, that colonialism itself continues in a lot of ways and places, and that people are, we're reacting to this. I think, the fact that we're having this panel and that we're talking about politics and leadership in science fiction, that we have all these books that are about politics and leadership in different worlds and how that can look different, means that we are in a place where those are big concerns of ours, that they're affecting our lives, and that there's some kinds of transitions going on where we're thinking about how they could be different, and seeing some shifts, and really that this is a topic that's really urgent for a lot of us.
I just want to say I was on a NASA convened a panel of a few science fiction writers, biologists, physicists, astronomers, to talk about what's going to happen if we find life, any form of life, like microbial life, and how are we going to relate to the fact that we could land on an uninhabited or an inhabited by the microbes life? What are we going to do? How are we going to face that? What are the possibilities? What do we need to think about? Because they feel that the colonialist attitude toward the universe is not dependent, we can carry that with us, even if supposedly everyone has, come to the post-colonial, we're no longer in the thrall of that, but we relate to the universe in a certain way that still needs to be addressed. And NASA wanted to think about that. So that's why they asked science fiction writers to come and help them think about that, because they recognize that they need to make some visible things about their own ways of relating to, interstellar travel, or not interstellar, but just within the solar system.
Mm-hmm. And
Toward the end, I would like to turn to Ada, because sometimes leadership is about what we do now, and I believe you've been doing some interesting work around that.
Well, what I was about to say to that was that, so similarly, and as an example of, real world building you could do to explore something like that, just as we could have a near future where we have the conflict between banning eating real animals versus continuing to practice traditional practices, you could have a first contact situation where humans have decided to be super careful about landing on planets with microbes. We'll never land on a planet which has microbes. We'll leave it alone. We'll only land on ones where we're absolutely sure there's nothing. And then they encounter aliens who think, oh, you land on planets? That's such a terrible violation of the rocks. We think it's only ethical to live in space stations. And we build space stations around our equivalent of Mars, but we never dare send a thing. And you could have that cultural conflict where people have come to different ethical decisions, or it could be the other way around. Right? It could be Earth that goes the ultra, we never land on things, and then they encounter some aliens who land us. Those are spaces in which you can have conflict, and you can understand both of those attitudes and the debates that could come, and even a war that could come if they're sufficiently upset.
And those were the debates.
Yeah,
that's what literally those are the things we were talking about in the room. So
the prime directive is impossible. I'm just going to say that we're out of time.
Yes.
Peace.
So we do have a minute where we can continue, and I would actually like to.
I think, Gadi, what you were trying to ask me about is to give the example of, what I'm doing at my university at the moment. Instead of normal teaching, I have convinced them that
30 seconds, please. I'm sorry for being rude.
Yes, what the students actually need is a giant campus-wide role-playing game where they're colonizing a terraformed exoplanet and have to decide how to design the world. And it's an incredibly exciting and uplifting thing because they're using their expertise on statecraft, architecture, biology, et cetera, to design the city and the farming. But they're also thinking about another world, thinking about different ways, thinking about these choices, building something, which is so incredibly empowering and uplifting as an act. It's the practice of political decision-making, which is what fiction does and what world building does.
That is, honestly, this has been an extremely cool panel. I would quickly go around in the 20 seconds we have. Do you have a good example in fiction where a new form of governance or government or something that made you really think that you encountered in the past few years? Really quick, we have 30 seconds. Anyone?
Wait, if I point at Ada and she points at me.
Yes, I was just thinking exactly that. read our
Self-love.
series together. Read them
Those
together.
books,
They're so
yes.
amazing together.
Yes.
And I'm
Fair
guessing
enough.
Andrea's too. I haven't read it yet, but my brother raves about it, so I'm just gonna.
Our book.
One,
Don't
any
go for our
taker,
book.
So
other
not,
than the
reason
sub,
we're
I
on the
love,
panel.
I'm
So it's
sorry,
not a
I have to be
new-
rude. We have no time. I'm
Goblin
sorry.
Emperor. Goblin Emperor. It's not
Go
a
in
new
for the last
war,
second.
right? It's
I'm
not a new
sorry,
form
you're
of
about to
government,
close
it's
us
a new way of thinking
down.
about it.
I'm really sorry, but they're closing us
Yes,
down.
if you had interrupted me fewer times, I would have been done before now. Carry on.
Thank you. On that note, I appreciate you all coming here. And thank you for attending this panel. Thank you for being panelists. It's been amazing. And on that note, goodbye.
Bye.
So